Good evening, everybody, and welcome to episode number 65 of Imprint Cast, the podcast dedicated to the Australian boutique label Imprint Films. My name is Tony Michas, and usually my partner and colleague, Mr. John Matthews, would be with us, but unfortunately he is unavailable today. But I'm not alone. Believe me, I have 3 Imprint Cast family members and 1 very special guest. But let's start off with the family. First up is our wonderful Imprint Cast family member, Miss Suzanne Boleyn. Suzanne, how you doing?
Hello, I'm good. It's not quite the dead of night here, but it is night time. So
Yes, indeed. And up next, of course, is our other family member, Mr. Paul Berriman. Paul, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. Very cold here, but doing good. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this one, Tony. I really appreciate it.
Oh, with our special guest, and you were with us on the last episode, it was a no-brainer.
Thank you.
And our last family member with us is our television guru, but we're not talking about a television series today. Mr. Jim Mulvihill. Jim, how you doing, good sir?
I'm fine, thank you, and thank you yet again for inviting me. And this is going to be a very interesting one.
Sure will be. And as we mentioned, we have a very special guest with us. He was on our show before discussing one of the greatest occult movies of all time, of the 90s at least, Roman Polanski's The Ninth Gate. And he's here with us again today, Dr. David Huckvale. David, thank you so much for joining us. How are you going?
I'm fine, thank you. Yes, it's wonderful to be here again. It was such fun last time, so this is great.
I'm so glad you enjoyed that the last time we all chatted about The Ninth Gate, because I gotta be honest with you, I thought it was a great chat. Don't get me wrong, but when you told us that you loved being with us, being with good company, it meant the world, because
It's completely true. It's just nice. I mean, writers like me spend most of the time on their own tapping away, so it's quite nice to have some company, during the day.
Yeah, I get you. Absolutely. For today's episode, we are going to be discussing probably one of the greatest horror anthology films of the 1940s. And this year, it is celebrating its 80th anniversary. I can't believe it. And of course, we are talking about Imprint Films release number 396, Dead of Night.
Know this part of the world at all? No. I've never been here before.
Like some tea, wouldn't you? Do you take milk and sugar? Milk and sugar, Mr. Craig. Milk and sugar, Mr. Craig.
Still there. So it isn't a dream this time?
I beg your pardon?
Yes, it isn't a dream this time. I must be going out of my mind. You see, everybody in this room is part of my dream. Everybody.
Gosh.
Good Lord, really?
Very extraordinary.
You're kidding.
What, all of us?
I can only tell you that when I came into this room, I recognized you all, instantly.
Having seen all our photographs in the newspapers, I take it, Dr. Van Sparken.
Of course, you may have seen me on the sports page. Motor racing's my line. Now's my chance. I can't make it. I can't make it.
Just room for one inside, sir.
Peter, it's the mirror. Mr. Rutherford told me about it. That's why I came back. It belonged to a man who was crippled, who accused his wife just as you're now accusing me. Peter, you must listen to me.
You're sort of teamed up with him, aren't you?
Him? My good man, think nothing of it. I'm just about through with that cheap ham anyway.
Okay.
Temper. You'll be sorry for this later, you know.
Yes, suppose I will.
Let's play another game.
Yes, hide and seek.
Who's to hide? I'll hide. I'll hide.
Yes, Mr. Crane will hide. Mr. Crane will hide. Mr. Crane will hide.
Just room for one more inside, sir.
Now, this film is also included in this double feature of wonderful anthology films of Flesh and Fantasy and Dead of Night. But for this one, we decided to go with Dead of Night because personally, I think it's the better film. I know a lot of people love Flesh and Fantasy, but this one has a special place for me. I absolutely adore it. Jim, when did you first see Dead of Night for the first time?
Oh, goodness. I think it was about 1973, 1974. And I remember when the music started, I thought, well, this has given me a feeling of dread because of the way it starts. I knew something was going to happen. And then you see this guy drive up in the car and the music changes completely. And he looks at this farmhouse and I think to myself, why is he looking like that? And, you know, as the story unfolds, I thought to myself, as soon as I learned why he was looking like that, I would have turned the car around and gone back home. But then we wouldn't have had the film. So about 1973, 74.
Okay. Suzanne, how about you? When was the first time you saw Dead of Night?
So when it came to DVD or Blu-ray, it was just one of those things that I knew it from reputation as this very influential anthology film. So, of course, watched it and loved it. It's just a beautiful, supernatural, uncanny collection of tales.
It was. Paul, how about you?
My first time was with this Imprint Blu-ray. Being a bit younger, a lot of these older films I get around to when they're being reissued with these nice new editions. So yeah, it was only this year, but it was a film which you had told me about and told me that one of the stories in particular within I would like, and you were right, I did. It's one we'll get to in our conversation, no doubt. Just a little tease there, but yeah, it was the first time this year on this Blu-ray, and I really, really loved it.
That's good. Yeah, the first time I've seen this was actually theatrically. In Sydney, there was a festival of Martin Scorsese's top 10 favorite horror films, and all 10 films were actually screening over the course of 5 weeks, over 5 double features. And I went to all of them. And the one that I saw first was, of course, The Innocents. It was a double feature of Dead of Night with The Innocents. And of course, there is one connection with The Innocents. Of course, David, you know this. The film's composer, Georges Ulrich, did both films. And my goodness, now that is a double feature I will never forget. But with Dead of Night, it actually surprised me how funny it was in moments. But I knew it was a horror film, but it really surprised me with some comedic moments it had. But there were 2 stories in particular, which we will discuss later on, that really got me. And of course, David, when did you first see Dead of Night?
I can't really remember, but I think it probably was when the good old BBC back in the 70s did their horror double bills on BBC Two on Saturday nights.
Yeah.
It must have been then, I think.
Yeah.
You know. What's great about this release is it actually does, just raising Jim's point about the music, it does actually clean the soundtrack up a bit. It's a pretty ropey recording, actually. Well, it's very old, isn't it? Mm-hmm. But the music does come across much better now. So I would have heard it in a rather sort of croakier version back in those days. But yes, that must have been it, I think. A long time ago.
For a film that's 80 years old, it still can get you. Believe me, I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's still very powerful. And of course, as the excellent extra on this disc by John Llewellyn Probert, who I know, he does this fantastic analysis of all the films that it sort of predicted, all the Amicus anthology films. So it's hugely influential because there weren't really many anthology films before this. And speaking in terms of the music, it's also interesting that this is actually one of, I think it's probably, I'm not sure, but I think it's the first Georges Auric film score for Ealing, predating the comedy ones for which he was more well known. So this was his sort of introduction to the whole thing. The comedy films all had to come later. It's interesting. People think, oh, Dead of Night's a departure from Ealing's staple, but actually those films like the Lavender Hill Mob and the Titfield Thunderbolt and Lady Killers and all those things, they came later. So this was the first thing they did in terms of a relationship with Georges Auric. Yeah, I think so.
Yes, I believe this is Ealing Studios' first and only horror film. Is that right? Yeah.
Well, yes, and I don't think Michael Balcon, who ran Ealing, wanted it to be known as a horror film. I think he would have thought of it more as a sort of supernatural film. Because, and this is something that John Llewellyn Probert talks about. It says, the word horror had very bad connotations for the British cinema at that time. It was considered to be an American thing. So I don't think it was necessarily sort of marketed as a horror film, as more of a sort of supernatural movie. And as you said, there's comedy in it too, which is a sort of relief from all the grimness.
I've always said this: a good horror movie has to have a little bit of humor in it, not a lot, but some of it, because eases the tension in some way.
I think you're right, and that goes back, all the way down to, you can go back to Shakespeare. Think of Macbeth. There's actually comedy in Macbeth. There's a lighten the mood a bit, just briefly. So yeah, it's necessary, I think, and it fits in really rather wonderfully. Actually, the interesting thing about the music for the comedy, the golf story, is that Georges Auric wrote the music in Paris, presumably to some cue sheets. Because this is long before you could do it on a video. Right. He must have seen the film. I'm not quite sure. But he may not have done. I don't know. Anyway, he wrote the music in Paris. It was then shipped to London, and they recorded it in the studio here. And of course, there were some problems, I think, getting all the Mickey Mousing, as it's called, the synchronization of the music to the action, which is very important in the golf story. It's all very balletic, really. And so that was a slight problem, I think, because he may not have got the timings absolutely right. Yeah, the music's very important to create the comedy in that particular section, I think. Yeah. And
it's a very black comedy, which...
Well, it is, isn't it, Suzanne?
Yes. It reminds me of those very witty films like Blithe Spirit, which we talked about recently, Tony. Very, very black, melancholy kind of humour as well, which is also very modern now, because we see a lot of black comedy now about death and, melancholy things.
Yeah, and I think some of the scenes in that golf story they're very beautiful, in a melancholy way, but they're very beautiful. The way that it's photographed, that lake is photographed, and the way that the character who drowns himself walks into the water, it's very, very brooding. It could easily be a serious segment. It always reminds me, actually, when he's walking into the water, of I'm sure you've seen the rise and fall of Reginald Perrin with the opening of that comedy show, which was popular in England. Who was in the rise and fall of Reginald Perrin?
Bernard Rossiter.
Bernard Rossiter, of course, yes. And at the beginning he walks into the ocean, commits suicide. It's similar sort of feeling to that. Yes, it is very melancholy. In fact, we could talk about the photography of this film, which I think is terribly important. It is fantastically photographed. There's some amazing lighting effects, which were the responsibility of Douglas Slocum. In his youth, the way that the faces particularly are photographed with a lot of uplighting, which creates that rather spooky effect. A lot of shadows. They created a great deal of the mood, I think, through the way it was lit and photographed. These scenes of the golfer walking into the lake are really very elegiac, I think. Yeah, especially with the music. Because Georges Auric, who we can talk about later, but he had a kind of light sense of humor as well, but a kind of macabre ability too. So he manages to articulate this sense of melancholy and comedy with a kind of mock funeral march, which I talk about in the little extra. Again, the balance of that is absolutely perfect.
I like that in that moment when he's drowning himself, that whole vignette, all the trees are bare. It's autumn, it's death. And I love how you see the little creatures and we see
Yeah.
the weasel,
Yes.
which I think foreshadows his friend's Weasley actions,
Oh,
which is such a nice little foreshadowing of what is going to be revealed. And then we see a little owl. And of course, if you see an owl in the daytime, it predicts death.
absolutely.
That's the folklore with seeing an owl during the day.
And Ulrich, again, picks up on that in the music. The music changes, becomes softer when we see the animals. So he was a very expert at picking up all the different shades in the music, which is, you know, a very important aspect of this movie. I think the way everything comes together. It's a very marvelous example of what cinema should be, which is what Wagner would have called a Gesamtkunstwerk, you know, bringing everything together in a very sensitive way. So yeah, it's a marvelous example of that, I think.
And I liked what you talked about in the extras about the composer's musical philosophy, about music being for all people and how film was a good medium for this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that whole aesthetic of the group of composers that Ulrich was part of, Les Six, you know, had this very democratic attitude to they were sort of against the elitism of romanticism in the 19th century. They wanted music to be for everybody, and they wanted it also to be accessible, because of course around this time in the 40s there were lots of musical developments taking place in the world of concert music that were not very accessible. There was serial style, a lot of elitism, and they were sort of wanting music to be much more easily understood by people. So they went back to the 18th century and sort of modeled their ideas on a much more melodically based and traditional harmony based style. So they were against that particular aspect, and I think film music requires that too. Yes, I mean he was a prolific film composer as well as a prolific concert composer, of course, but you know he didn't change his style. You see, that's the thing. What happens nowadays in movies is that there are kind of people write for the movies, and there's a sort of generic movie style, which you know you can hear on Classic FM all the time. Well, there's nothing wrong with that in itself, but it's the trouble with it is that it's kind of oppressive in a way. You've got to write in that sort of style. You can tell it's movie music. Whereas if you listen to a lot of this stuff from people like Ulrich or all the other people from that period, like Vaughan Williams, they were writing music. They didn't, and Korngold, for instance, in Hollywood, he didn't change his style. They wrote music in their own idiom and adapted it to the film. I think that's what makes these composers so interesting. They were it was just another aspect of what they were doing. It wasn't a separate thing. That's why it's such a rich sound you get from these people.
And I like how you talk about these film composers, and of course we hear a lot about directors, we hear a lot about big stars and lots of stories, but you're giving these maybe lesser known, lesser talked about people stories.
Well, the thing is that people sort of, I suppose it's what should happen. Film music, you shouldn't really be kind of thinking of it in its own right. I mean, the function of film music is support the film. And I think a lot of people who are great fans of film, well, I'm a great fan of film music, but a lot of people who are just sort of exclusively interested in film music and think it should be listened to on its own. Well, there's nothing wrong with listening to it on its own, but it's not doing the same thing as a symphony or a concerto or whatever, or a piece of pop music for that matter, which is sort of self-contained. It's not designed to be listened to on its own. It can be listened to on its own. The whole point of it is to support the film. So it's a different sort of composing in technical terms. But in terms of the style and the idiom, it's very much still the composer's job, the composer's idiom. You know, so the film music is not meant to be listened to in its own right specifically. In a way, that's why people don't talk about film music so much, because it's sort of just there, and you're not necessarily aware of it. I remember David Whittaker, who wrote for Hammer, Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, for example. He told me once, he said, well, a film without music is a bit like a car without wheels. It needs not wall-to-wall music by any means, but it needs that extra element to give it momentum and a sort of beefiness, which it probably wouldn't have without. So it's vitally important. And as Jim said, it's from the very moment that the film starts, something is going to happen because of this very oppressive music at the beginning, and then it changes, yes, and you get this much lighter. It gives you a false sense of security. Suddenly you think, oh well, it's perhaps not that kind of film anymore. Would you get that feeling to such an extent without the music? I'm not sure you would, because you could put sinister music to that car arriving and it would work. You'd think, oh right, we're still in this sort of creepy area. But changing the music just does that extra element to sort of make you a bit more disconcerted, really, perhaps a little less certain about what you're going to watch. So it's a very powerful thing to do. And another of the things that Georges Auric does in this film score is to show you how his own, his ordinary musical style was very different. He would write little cafe waltzes. There's a wonderful little waltz when in the Mirror story they go out for dinner. And again, it's a little waltz, which you're not meant to be that aware of, but it's the kind of thing that Georges Auric would be quite happy to write for the piano or a small orchestra or whatever. It's very much in his style. And when the lady is playing the piano in the Christmas Tale, when they all go off and play hide and seek, she plays a little piece that could easily be a piano piece by well, it is a piano piece by Auric, but it's rather like one of his concert pieces, written in this neoclassical style, which Les Six was so well known for.
And this story you tell about Auric in your extra, it really kind of brought home to me this intersection of all the arts and how they reflect society and these social currents in a very interconnected way, which I get through, say, knowing about visual art, but it's the visual art, the music, the performing art, it's all traveling along this same kind of current.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I think cinema is the art form of the 20th century, really. And, it was all sort of thought about in the 19th century, the idea of bringing all the arts together. I mentioned Wagner. I mean, that kind of idea of uniting everything. But I mean, it could never really work so well on the stage as it does in the movies, which is able to manipulate reality far more successfully than the stage can. And I think it was sort of predicted in the 19th century, but it really came to its fulfillment in the 20th with this invention of moving pictures. So, I mean, I'm waffling a bit, but I mean, the whole idea of music with film is an interesting one. Why does it need it? And that's something else perhaps we could talk about later on. But yeah, I agree. Auric was extremely accomplished at doing this. Not every composer is. I mean, it's a very technical thing. You've got to be very good at maths. You've got to be able to, when you realize that you've got to actually make musical sense, but at the same time put it in a tight timing. That's really, really something to be able to do that. So it doesn't sound sort of suddenly chopped off. You've got to time everything so that it fits absolutely accurately. And not every composer, I think, would be willing to do that or able to do it. It does require a certain approach to things, which James Bernard had that to a T. When you think you've got to end a cue at 1 minute 4 seconds, 4 3/4 seconds. I mean, it's that accurate. And looking at some of the scores that I've seen over the years, you see composers saying, right, there's an arrow, and says no, that's got to line up with whatever happens in the score. And that's and to play it as well to fit those timings is pretty difficult. It's a special art. I think another of the things about this film, the way it's photographed is quite interesting. There are a lot of close-ups of objects as well, which is something I've always been interested in films, to make an object significant. There's one very good example, Dr. van Straten, the Frederick Falk character. He wears these glasses, which are significant in the plot. And when they're talking about it, the camera zooms towards it. And this is something which only film can do, to impregnate an inanimate object with some sort of significance by means of zooming or by means of lighting. And it's something you see a lot in subsequent films, which I think is another of the things which this film sort of anticipated. If you think of Hammer's Taste of Fear, which Seth Holt directed fantastically, there are a lot of inanimate objects in that film. There's a car, there's a piano, there's a telephone, there's all sorts of things. He just zooms into these objects, investing them with kind of dread, but at the same time you realize this is something somehow significant. And I think this is one of the things the film does before all those films. Another of the reasons it's so so influential in the way he uses that. When in the mirror story, we see Ralph Michael, isn't he? He's the actor. Peter Corlett is the character. He says the mirror is drawing him into this strange room. And when he's talking, the camera zooms to his face. So we're being drawn into him. I mean, these are techniques which were later hugely used in thrillers and horror films, which this film anticipated, I think, in a way that hadn't been done. I think it was a very innovative film in the technique that it uses. So yeah, it influenced so many things. I mean, there's all those Amicus films, and some of the stories in the Amicus films are very similar. You know, there are mirrors that draw people into their mystic world. There's a door that draws in a strange room in one of them from beyond the grave. The idea of being taken over by a character, which happens in the mirror story, comes back in The Haunted Palace, the Vincent Price film, where he's taken over by an ancestor's portrait and starts behaving like him. So, I mean, that's another of the influences this film had.
I picked up on that as well, and I thought that was a really wonderful symbol, because he is the person that's trying to peer inside the mind. He's trying to look in, and the glasses break, and then, you know, he meets his fate, so he fails to see. He's unable to see what his fate is very soon, so he can't really see. So the film is full of all these symbols. Like I said, the weasel, the owl, the glasses, they foreshadow, they foretell, they mean something to the character. If you look in the film, every segment in the background, we get so many clocks as we refer, you know, to this theme of time. We get mirrors. So there's mirrors throughout the whole film. The final vignette with the ventriloquist, that's also full of mirrors. So I did pick up on that through the whole film.
Yeah, no, it's extremely symbolic. Those things are kind of new for British film, I think, at that time. And that's one of the reasons why this film's so good. I don't think that many films were using symbols to quite such an extent, really. Well, that dummy film is hugely influential, isn't it? I mean, it probably was based on a story by Gerald Kirsch called the Extraordinarily Horrible Dummy, which came out, I think, in 1934. The dummy is described, it had a homemade look. There was something disgustingly avid in the stare of its bulging blue eyes, the lids of which clicked as it winked, and an extraordinarily horrible ghoulishness in the smacking of its great grinning wooden lips. So, I mean, that probably inspired the story, but in the wake of the movie, I mean, it went on to inspire all sorts of things. There's magic, isn't there? Most famously with Anthony Hopkins. There's an episode of The Twilight Zone with Telly Savalas, isn't there, called Living Doll, with a horrible talking doll called Talkie Tina. Barbarella has creepy dolls in it that have teeth. There's an Alfred Hitchcock Presents episode with Claude Rains called And So Died Aria Bushinska, which is the name of his dummy. There's, of course, the Child's Play franchise. There's 2 films called Devil Doll. You know, it was the beginning of a big explosion of nasty dummies. And actually, I think also it goes further than that in the idea of kind of robots and AI. I mean, one of my books, which I'll advertise here, Artificial Intelligence in the Movies, tries to sort of connect the two. So these sort of devil dolls have a connection with, you know, what we now use as robots. The anxiety of the artificial is basically what I'm trying to say. Creating artificial men, which goes back to Frankenstein. I mean, it's all part of that trope, isn't it, really? So again, hugely influential in this one film. Yeah, amazing.
I see that dummy in deep red, actually, in that funny little fellow from Deep Red. That, you know, I see that. And of course, the doll I guess, leads us to that fear and idea of magical fetishism, that inanimate object can be inhabited by a spirit or by, in this case, maybe the character's dark psyche, aspects of his dark nature projected into this doll, which is like, a magical fetish. And I think that's one reason why people are scared of dolls. They're creepy, but there's also this very old idea of the fetish.
Yeah. No, they also kind of represent our own unconscious or our own buried desires, don't they? And the things that we repress about ourselves. There's a very good episode of that fantastic BBC series Supernatural back in the 70s, around the time that those double bills were being screened in 76, 77, called Victoria, which if you haven't seen, you really must, in conjunction with this film, because it's about a doll that again is extremely nasty. And but it sort of represents the hidden desires, the murderous desires of a little girl. I mean, we're frightened of dolls because we're frightened of robots and AI probably because we're actually rather frightened about ourselves. We're a violent species. We have all sorts of urges and drives which we'd rather hide. So perhaps that's one of the reasons why we're so fascinated with it. We're kind of frightened. I think probably we're frightened quite a lot about ourselves, which is why we have horror films in a way to explore these aspects. And one of the reasons why horror films are not or weren't respectable, and why this film was not marketed as a horror film, because that's a nasty and unsophisticated and rather un-British thing, is because that's what they do. They undermine our sense of what we like to think of ourselves as being, I think. So in a way, horror films need to be on the periphery of respectability. They operate in the twilight zone themselves, don't they? If you make them too respectable, if they become too mainstream, I suppose, they kind of perhaps lose their edge a bit. They are subversive in many ways. I mean, horror is much more. It's everywhere now. Horror is just sort of all over the place. But back in the 70s, I remember there were a handful of books. You were kind of searching around for books about horror films. It was not something people talked about a lot. It's interesting now that it is mainstream. Is that because we've lost a lot of our inhibitions, our sexual inhibitions, our political anxieties, the fact that science has made a lot of the predictions of horror films come true? Is that why it's more mainstream? I don't know. It's an interesting development, which perhaps aren't specific answers, but it's certainly changed. Yeah. But anyway, going back to the symbolism of the film and all these things like the owl and the glasses, the dummy is another example of it. It's another symbol, isn't it? A particularly nasty one. But I mean, there's nothing more frightening. I think the most frightening thing for me in this film is when right at the end, the dummy comes to life and strangles Michael Redgrave in his cell. That is still fairly creepy, although it's a little midget or a dwarf or whatever playing the part. It's still frightening, and I think that's probably the one image I've always retained in my mind. That whole nightmare sequence at the end is the kind of stylistic peak of the whole film. I mean, you could take that out and have that as a sort of miniature film in its own right. It is full of the most amazing Dutch angles, for example. Using an angle of the camera which is all tilted does create a sense of disorientation. The whole thing is really about dreams. In fact, actually, this is where, again, this is something that John mentions in his marvelous extra. He says it's probably the whole dream sequence, the idea of coming to a house and that you're dreaming about a house and it comes true, may come from E.F. Benson's story, The Room in the Tower, where there's this passage. It was when I was about 16 that a certain dream first came to me, and this is how it befell. It opened with my being set down at the door of a big red brick house where I understood I was going to stay. The servant who opened the door told me that tea was going on in the garden. Well, it's going on in the sitting room in the film, isn't it? And led me through a low, dark panelled hall with a large open fireplace. I think there's a fire also burning in the film, and onto a cheerful green lawn set round with flower beds. But this dream he has comes true. So the whole film is really about dreams. I think cinema is at its best when it's talking about the unconscious and dreams. This is why horror films, so-called, have always interested me most about movies, because I'm very interested in the unconscious. And I think that most of human history and most of our actions are actually motivated by subconscious, irrational desires. We kind of we need the rational, but we kind of perhaps overrate it as the sort of driving force of history. We are kind of irrational creatures, and that's what these films talk about so much. So it is a dream. Going back to what I was saying, that final section is a marvelous description of the dream. And of course, it recapitulates the previous stories. And there's another connection I think you can make, which is a musical one. This idea of recapitulating all these stories at the end in a nightmarish way is something you can sort of, I've thought of tracing back to Beethoven, because in the end of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, what he does is to take snatches of each of the themes of the previous three movements and sort of try them out again and say, well, is this really what I wanted to say? And then he kind of rubs them out with this sort of angry line for cellos. It kind of says, no, that's not what I want. And then you have that famous Ode to Joy, which says, this is what I've really been trying to find out all along. And the final movement comes. And that was an idea that inspired Berlioz too. At the end of Berlioz's sort of viola concerto called Harold in Italy, which is based on a Byron poem. He does the same thing. He quotes the previous three movements and then starts off with the finale. So that's really a musical precursor to what this film is doing. It's sort of tasting the previous stories in a finale. Yeah. So it's another repercussion of this film.
And of course, the ending gets really expressionistic and exaggerated, which also refers to the surreal and the subconscious and the nightmares and dreams, which is, of course, what makes up a large part of the Gothic.
Yeah, yes, indeed. And as I've said before, it influenced so many things. There's a marvelous sequence where the main character is surrounded by all those party people, and they're all looking at him, and the camera sort of spins around. You see these grinning, nasty faces. And that idea crops up in several films. I can think of The Kiss of the Vampire. That happens in Hammer's vampire story.
Interview with the Vampire. There's a scene that's very much like Toulouse-Lautrec. You know, the vampires coming in very shadowy with dark eyes. So it refers to that kind of dark French impressionistic art. As well as the Gothic, of course.
Yes, yeah, it's. I mean, I think one of the influences upon this film, as indeed on most horror films, would have been the German expressionist films of the 20s. I mean, it does have elements of that in the way it's lit and in the all those Dutch angles, the distortions, in other words. I mean, it's very interesting that I was talking about this in my the book I've just finished. Apropos of Terence Fisher, who's marvelous, of course, but he wasn't an expressionist director. He kind of let the film happen, and he caught it and he arranged it beautifully. But I mean, he doesn't really use Dutch angles very much. I think the only Dutch angle I can think of in a Terence Fisher film is in The Mummy, where Felix Elmer is in his nursing home and Fisher tilts the camera to create the sense of anxiety of this guy who thinks the mum is about to come and get him, which indeed it does. I can't think of many other examples of expressionism, distorting reality in a Terence Fisher film, which are very sort of materialistic and corporeal and normal in a way, to try and normalize horror, which works brilliant in its own way. But this film is not like that at all. I mean, this predates Hammer by quite a long time. So it is very expressionistic. And it'd be interesting, I haven't gone through and counted how many cuts there are, but it's highly cut. There are lots and lots of different angles, lots of different shots, all joined together, of course, by fantastic music, which acts as a sort of glue, which is perhaps not the world's greatest metaphor for the marvelous Georges Auric music, but it does. It stitches everything together. So that's where music is absolutely essential to avoid a sense of not knowing where you are. The music drives you through it. That's the peak of the film for me, I think.
And that scene's really feels like a true nightmare in the frenetic editing that you mentioned. And then as you go back to the main character, it's a zoom in on him and his movements in bed, and you then focus on this character who is then awakening from that nightmare, and you almost feel like you've experienced the nightmare yourself as a viewer in that section, from both the editing and the music and the camera work.
there are a lot of nightmares in movies, because I mean that's what cinema does so well. Think of famously of Spellbound, the Hitchcock film with the Dali illustration or the Dali set designs. I mean that's a famous example of a sort of rather stylized dream, but on slightly lesser high-flown films like Hammer's nightmare film. I mean, that starts off with a nightmare. I think films do nightmares really well, but this is one of the very best nightmares, I think. Not least because there's a lot going on, so you're going from one story to another very rapidly. So that's bewildering. Whereas if you just have a single episode like the one in the Hitchcock film, it's weird and freaky, but it's just one idea, whereas we've got lots of different ideas going on here. And that again is how the mind works. The mind rushes from one thing to another. It doesn't have a logical progression in the way, certainly when you're dreaming, but I mean, even when you're reading. I mean, I was reading a book last night, I thought I haven't taken in anything of this. I was thinking of something else. You know, your mind is got juggling lots of different things together. And I think cinema does that really well, being able to juxtapose things. And pile things on top of each other. And I can't think of a British film that does anything quite as extreme as that. I mean, this film really did, I think, break the ground. But there weren't very many horror films being made at this in England. I mean, there was a few, like the Boris Karloff The Ghoul, which is a curious document, not least from a musical point of view. I won't go on to that, but there weren't that many. No, it was not something that we did. There was a version of The Fall of the House of Usher with dear Gwen Watford as a very young woman. Strange sort of little film. So there were them, but they didn't really. We didn't really do that. I think it was just considered bad taste. It's a very interesting thing, and of course, you know, when I was, I always remember, this is a personal anecdote, but I did when I did my doctorate, I did a thesis on Wagner and how Wagner had anticipated movies, and some of the movies I talked about in that thesis were Hammer films. So I subtitled my thesis how Wagner had anticipated music in Hammer films. And as I walked up, I was in Ely Cathedral in my little robe, and as I walked up to the podium to get my award, my thesis title was read out, and I did hear some titters in the audience, which I was rather proud of. But I mean, it's still these films are still considered with a sort of, you know, they're a bit silly, you know. But that's only because people don't want to engage. I think they're probably frightened. People often laugh at what they're frightened of, don't they?
But the lovely thing about this film is that you're taken along for the ride as he's approaching in the car. As I said before, he gives this look of recognition. And we go through this nightmare with him, and then only to be awoken by his wife. And he said, "Oh, I've had this terrible dream." And then she says a phone call, and she says, "Oh, I'm going to go to the country." And she says, "It'd be wonderful for you. You'd be away for a couple of days, and it might help you with this dream." Now, you're not sure, is it a continuation, or has he dreamed about what he's about to do, or if it's just a continuation of the dream? It can be interpreted in so many ways. It's an absolutely thought-provoking film.
Well, yeah, it's. I can't remember that. I should have remembered who it was, but I can't remember who it was. But it did influence a sort of theory about the circularity of time. You know, the fact that we repeat things. And this isn't particularly a new idea, I suppose, but the idea that everything has happened before and everything's going to happen again.
It's the steady state theory was one of the theories.
Probably it, isn't it? Who came up with that? I can't.
I'm sorry, I didn't write it down, but it was the kind of alternative to the Big Bang Theory. And I was going to mention at some point the links that this film has to the idea of eternalism, which is about the fluidity of time. Of course, with time being a major theme of this film, it's very concerned with time. We see, as I said, clocks in so many scenes, mirrors, and mirrors record the passing of time, similar to a clock, but in, you know, a more subtle kind of way. They're a witness to time. They're a witness to the psyche as well. So this obsession with time relates to that concept of eternalism, and that all points in time exist all at once. Therefore, sometimes we can experience a time slip or a premonition. We can maybe peek into the future, or into the past. We can see ghosts, etc. And such ideas were really common. They actually crop up a lot at this point in literature and film, particularly within romance, melodrama, or what were considered women's stories. So I did think of some examples, which were Peter Ibbotson from 1935, which is an absolutely beautiful film. Of course, A Matter of Life and Death is very concerned with these issues of time and the afterlife, etc. Portrait of Jenny was another from 1948. Corridor of Mirrors, also from 1948. And later we have Picnic at Hanging Rock, both the book by Joan Lindsay and the film in 1975, and of course famously Somewhere in Time in 1980, all of which are concerned with this idea of eternalism. And it was an idea also really heavily imprinted on British children's fiction. And it's something I grew up with, and books like Children of Green Know, Moondial, etc. And I guess maybe the reason for this interest in eternalism at this time was probably largely riding that wave of spiritualism and its popularity after the First and Second World War, when a lot of people were grieving. Therefore, there was a big interest and focus on ideas about the afterlife, eternalism, time. And it also coincided with this increased scientific interest in the philosophy of time, even though ideas of eternalism had existed since the classical period. People were reading a lot more about spiritualism, the occult, philosophy, and psychology, which we already mentioned. The film is very concerned with psychology. And in the context of this time, I would just say it was largely men who went off to war and died. So basically, in essence, they went away and disappeared, never to be seen again, with no closure. And it was the women who were left behind with this legacy of grief and loss. So it's not really a surprise that eternalism and the supernatural is found in a lot of what were considered women's fiction or women's films, like the Gothic and melodrama and the supernatural and uncanny, like this film. So that's something I got from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's as you say, it's an old idea, and sometimes it's used sort of metaphorically. I mean, Nietzsche, who is an interest of mine, he came up with this idea of eternal recurrence. He said if you've got to embrace everything. So if you've said yes to one happiness, you must say yes to all the unhappiness, because then it goes round and round and round. I'm not sure he meant it literally, but it's an interesting metaphor, that everything will happen again, and you have to sort of embrace that. And another person who occurred to me while you were talking, Suzanne, is J.B. Priestley, who wrote this interesting book, Man and Time. But of course, he's famous for his time plays, like An Inspector Calls, which was turned into a movie with Alastair Sim, of course, Time and the Conways. These are all about the circularity of time. That the past belongs in the future, and the future can be seen in the past. This film can be related to all that, I think, in quite a powerful way. So yes, there is something very unnerving about the idea of the recurring dream, and the idea that things will happen again. Yes, you can't avoid it. The way the film ends is that's particularly frightening. The idea of the circle. You can't escape your destiny. In other words, it's going to happen. No matter what you try and do. Which I think.
That is very much the uncanny, which refers to something that's strange or unusual, but is also unsettling. But it's usually within a familiar environment or setting, which makes it even more unsettling, that it's this familiar everyday life.
Yes, well, I think what some of the most powerful ways you can unnerve people is to take the ordinary and say that it isn't normal. Nothing is normal. Nothing is ordinary. And I think this film does that by undermining. Well, right at the beginning, you're told this is going to be creepy. Then suddenly it isn't. It's normal, but it isn't quite normal. I think actually Suzanne's point about the uncanny, which Freud analysed brilliantly in an essay on the subject, is what this film is. This is not a horror film. I think this is an uncanny film, isn't it? It's about the way reality isn't what you think it is. There's no such thing as sort of the mundane. Everything, all these objects that are being focused on, everything is rather strange. Everything is symbolic of another kind of world. The world in the mirror, perhaps, the world in the haunted chamber, the world where the dummy comes from. It's reality is not ordinary. I think that's why this film is so powerful. It is an uncanny movie, yes.
That's how I see it. It's a story of the uncanny or supernatural, uncanny and Fortean phenomena, which is unexplained and mysterious and outside of scientific understanding. All those funny things right from the beginning, the bus conductor.
The bus conductor, yeah.
And that introduces us straight away to the uncanny and the idea of time. It shows us explicitly the time slip by showing the clock, by showing day and night. So it just gets us straight into this idea of time.
Yeah, I think the way that's done visually is so powerful, because again, it's to do with the way there are close-ups, the close-up of the clock, which of course stops ticking, the close-up of the actor's face. It's Anthony Baird, isn't it? Yeah, he's spookily lit, but it's an ordinary place. It's an ordinary hospital bedroom, and suddenly it becomes completely unordinary. So that's a perfect example of the uncanny. I think that's interesting that we should start off with that film, that story. It almost sort of says, well, this is the kind of film we're going to be in now. Don't expect what you think you're going to get. Everything is odd. Yeah. Even when we see the accident of the bus, that's all model work, which admittedly is trying to be real. Yeah. So perhaps I'm over-interpreting. But the fact that it isn't real, but looks real, is in itself uncanny, I think. I mean, that's probably an unintentional element of uncanniness, but there is something very strange about that accident. It looks like the real thing, but it isn't. So again, that sort of helps the uncanny movie.
Well, that particular one is the most frightening one for me. He's talking about, he's a race car driver, he's talking about this accident. He's in hospital. He's been there for 7 days. He's calling the nurse Peggy, and she's not Peggy, she's somebody else. And then he realizes, and when she says good night, the nurse says good night to him, and she goes away. And he's reading the book, and you hear the radio playing in the background. You hear the clock ticking, and all of a sudden the radio stops. The sound from the radio stops. The clock stops ticking. He's drawn to the window. He draws the curtains, and it's 4:15 in the morning at this time. Where it started off, it was 9:45. He looks out, and it's bright sunlight, bright daylight, and then he sees the hearse with the horse-drawn hearse, and the man saying, "There's room for one more." And he goes back. He's obviously confused at this point. He goes back, sits on the bed, and then gradually the radio comes on, and the ticking of the clock. And then he looks at the clock. He's actually lost 5 minutes. Now that's scary. Then he talks to the doctor or the psychiatrist the next day, and he relays the story. And of course, as usual, a psychiatrist explains it away. He goes back to his bed. He said, "Well, I'll be out 6 or 7 days." He's out 7 days. He goes to the bus stop. A chap asks him the time. He says 4:15, and he gives a look of recognition. He remembers the 4:15 on the clock. And then when he sees the bus conductor, and the bus conductor says one more, a room for one more. He doesn't get on the bus, and then, as you said, you see the bus crash, and he relays the story, and he said, "Well, that saved my life." Now, that to me was the most frightening of the lot, because he's in an ordinary room, and it's overnight, and then it becomes daylight. It's stayed with me all my life.
I think it's the most unnerving of all the episodes. I think because it's the most normal. There isn't a dummy, a spooky dummy. There isn't a magic mirror. It's just reality, and suddenly reality is reorganized. And of course, it's something that many people have experienced, these sort of premonitions. I think everyone, to some extent, has something a bit like that in their life. So yes, it's the most normal and the most abnormal of the sections.
You mean the deja vu moments?
Well, yeah, I think so. Yeah. Well, life is full of odd coincidences. My dear husband Andy, years ago, he was given a little card of a squirrel by one of his relatives. This is long decades before I ever knew him, and he kept it because he liked it. And when he first came to see me, he was amazed. He said, "That's the card," and it was a painting. I had the original of my mum by my mother of a squirrel. Now the chances of that happening, are astonishing. So that's a similar sort of weird coincidence, isn't it? And I think we all have those sort of things happening in life, and this film picks up on that. Another great sequence, I think, which is easy to ignore, is the sequence at the end of the dummy story when they are going to see Michael Redgrave in his asylum bed, and we track down a corridor at the hotel, and there's the orderly next to these two people who are going to go and see him. This idea of tracking down a corridor, again, is kind of unnerving. The idea of enclosed space, and I think a lot of filmmakers have been inspired by that. There's almost a repeat of that scene in Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, which of course Seth Hawke began to film for Hammer before he died, and there is exactly the same scene happening there of two people, Valerie Leon and her boyfriend, walking down with an orderly down a long corridor to see a man who's insane in a cell. This idea of being enclosed and entrapped, you can't escape the irrational. You're in this sort of corridor of time almost. So he did that. The same image comes back in Freddie Francis's The Nightmare for Hammer. There were corridors in that, tracking shots going down corridors. It's a sort of image like the time tunnel in that TV series, of time as a tunnel, time as a corridor. In fact, you can't escape it, you can't get out of it. Again, it's using an ordinary image to create a psychological anxiety. Yeah,
which is the most frightening and the most relatable.
Yeah, because everyone's experienced it. There's nothing exotic about it. I mean, there's again, thinking in terms of influence, there's a marvelous scene in Ingmar Bergman's Wild Strawberries, the famous actor who was in all of Ingmar Bergman's.
Oh God, no!
Mats von Sydow.
Mats von Sydow. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you.
I think it's not of him. It isn't him. It's another actor. Anyway, he's walking down a street, an ordinary street. And strange things happen. He creates a very, very uncanny mood.
Yeah.
Out of nothing, really.
Yeah.
Out of the ordinary. Yeah. So
if you were to relay this story to somebody in their 20s, they would say, "Oh, this is boring." But if you sat them down in front of the film and take their phone away, they would actually get drawn into the movie itself. It's a brilliant movie.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing, you see, movies now are sort of about things happening. Often the most unnerving things are about things not happening. I mean, nothing really happens in that first story. Nothing in terms of action. There's not really very much happening at all. It's about place and mood, atmosphere and mood. It's in that sense, it's a bit like
and love.
And love, of course, which most movies are about, I suppose. But yes, this idea of environment, I'm kind of interested in that. It's what a lot of symbolist sort of turn of the century paintings were about. This idea of there's that great I think he's Danish, isn't he? Hammershøi, the artist Hammershøi, who just painted empty rooms, perhaps with the door open. Perhaps you see a glimpse of someone behind the door walking. You don't need action to create atmosphere. And I think that the symbolist playwright Maurice Maeterlinck once said that the most exciting thing you can put on stage is an empty room, and you're waiting for something to happen. You don't need a lot of action. In fact, action is actually sometimes quite boring. It's an adrenaline rush, but it's not an emotional rush necessarily. No.
I'd be interested to know everyone's favourite segment from the film.
Oh, yeah.
You beat me to that. I was going to ask that myself.
Yeah.
I think it's probably, for me, there's the first story that's the best, I think.
And me.
It's the most the most frightening. It's the most unnerving. It's short. It's succinct. It's got no devices in it, like mirrors and things. And it's therefore the most unnerving, I think. Plus the final sequence, which is much more elaborate, of course, as a piece of filmmaking. But I think in terms of the thing which stayed with me most, I think it is that first story.
Yeah.
I do like how it's an old-fashioned hearse. It's a Victorian hearse. So again, back to the what time is this? That fluidity of time. It's not a 1940s hearse. It's a Victorian hearse.
Yeah, the idea that of course, with dear old Miles Malleson, I think he says there's a slight difference in what he says to begin.
Yes, there is. Yeah.
Isn't there? He says there's room for one. There's room for one more. There's room on. I think on top. Yeah. The bus. But he says something else at the end as well, which I can't remember what it was. But room for something at the end. It sounds. What I remember is there's room for one more.
Yeah.
At the beginning, and room for one more inside at the end.
Yeah.
So they're parallel statements, but they're not absolutely accurately the same. Which I think is a nice little detail to say. The future. I'm predicting a future event which isn't going to involve a hearse, but it's the same sort of idea.
But he was everywhere. That actor.
He was. Yes, he was.
Yes. I mean, I grew up with that actor. For God's sake, in my little box watching him. Yeah. Never knew his name. But I knew his face.
Yes. Well, he was talking about comedy relief in movies. He was the comedy relief in the Hammer films, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. Yeah.
Eccentric clergymen and eccentric undertakers and people like that.
Yeah.
Which are very important aspects of these films.
I'm not sure how you feel, but if I saw him, to me the screen brightened up because he was a familiar face.
So, Paul, what's your favourite?
Well, I'm going to cheat a little bit and say two, only because the second one you'll understand why. Firstly, my favourite was the ventriloquist story. For me, kid grew up in the 90s watching Goosebumps, and Night of the Living Dummy was one of my favourite stories. And Slappy, the dummy in those stories, is a sinister little dummy who is just like evil and creepy, and that creeped me out as a kid. And so when Tony mentioned that there was a ventriloquist dummy segment in this film, when it got to that, which is like, anticipation is the last one, of course, that one came on like, wow, this is like Slappy. So maybe R.L. Stine was inspired part by this film because it's very much got those vibes. And that particular scene is written really well. Michael Redgrave gives an absolutely stunning performance, and I love his facial performance. I don't know if he did actually learn ventriloquism for the role, but his mouth moves ever so slightly in different moments, and then there's really subtle moments where he's got his face to the camera and the other actor is in the background with the dummy. All that sort of framing is really great. But then I also really like the wraparound story or the framework story, the actual the dream and the characters chatting in the house, and they all decide, right, we'll all share our supernatural stories. For me, as an anthology, it works really well to frame each of the stories within. So that's my cheat answer of the two favorite stories within.
And I know what yours is, Tony.
My favorite is The Haunted Mirror. I love that story. And watching it again in preparation for this episode, it still affects me. And she doesn't get mentioned enough, but Googie Withers, she's incredible. And that sequence when she goes back to the antique shop and talking about and speaks to the antique shop dealer about the history of the story of the mirror, that really got me. That really haunted me for some reason, but it was so good. That's probably my favorite. That when I first saw Dead of Night in the theater, that entire sequence blew me away. I loved it, every moment of it.
What's good about that, when she goes to the antique shop, I can't remember the name of the actor who plays the antique dealer, but anyway, he's dressed in 19th century outfit, which is interesting because you think, oh yes, well of course he would have been, because this is the 40s. He'd have grown up perhaps in the 1890s, and it makes you realise the sort of chronology of this film and where it came from. It's part of that tradition from the 19th century, which a lot of these stories came from. E.F. Benson, the 19th century writer. So not only is it sort of a homage to the writers who influenced this film, but you think, oh yeah, of course, well, this is where that film was made, and this is why it's not strange for a man to have been dressed in that way in the 1940s. No.
I have to say that the golfing one, from a moral point of view, is quite strange. And, you know, the lady in question has no say into which man she's going to marry, whoever wins this golf game, you know, and she's very passive, which I find very strange. I mean, I'm not sure if that was a thing of the times, because you know, from what I heard, people were, you know, women wouldn't be walked upon, you know, and this woman just seems to be just, she doesn't matter. It doesn't matter which man wins, she'll marry him, and I find that very strange. And also,
Well, I think that says maybe more about the men than about her.
yeah.
They're kind of interchangeable, really. These two kind of buffoons, really, who don't really care about her. They care more about her game of golf. So for her, she's like, either one will do.
Yeah. But that's carrying on. That's carrying on from Where the Lady Vanishes, where they were talking about cricket all the time.
Yeah. It's those two characters they played. Yeah, it's a sort of reprise of those two characters, isn't it?
And Googie was in that as well. Don't forget.
She was also in They Came to a City, which is an amazing, visually an amazing film, which is, I think, J.B. Priestley again, isn't it? So,
yes, it is.
Yeah. So you know, that's another connection, and she's fantastic in that. Yeah, it's a very, very beautiful film. I think it's visually.
Well, the first time I ever saw her was Within These Walls, when she was quite elderly. Yeah, playing the prison governor. Yeah, and of course then I've gone back in her career, and I thought, my God, this was a wonderful actress all the way through. Yeah.
Well, yes, no, true. But it's interesting how these people, you know, were great, and then their reputations don't necessarily linger as much as other people's. But yeah, she deserves to be remembered. You mentioned Michael Redgrave's performance. I think another thing that this film anticipates or foreshadows or influences, at the end of that dummy story, he's lying in bed and mouths the dummy's voice comes through his rather impassive face. It looks very strange. And I think this is very like the end of Psycho, where you see Anthony Perkins as Mummy. You know,
I never thought of that.
Yeah, it's a very similar moment. So I think perhaps Hitchcock might have had that scene in mind. I don't know, but it's.
I thought because it was such a modern kind of psychological aspect to him, that this violence comes from the dark, disturbed psychological, that really did imprint lots of films like Peeping Tom, Psycho, Who Killed Teddy Bear, all those ones, Frenzy, much more about this dark, violent psyche that's within and uncontrollable beneath this veneer, this kind of polite veneer. So I definitely got that it was very influential in terms of that very modern take on this horror.
I mean, it is a sort of reworking of the Frankenstein idea that the thing you create destroys you. It's much more psychologically powerful, I would think, than in the film. Again, because it's not a monster. It's ordinary, and it's something you can see in reality. So therefore, it is more frightening. So yes, I think that's a powerful psychological moment. Anyway, at the end of that,
and it's a reflection of him, just like the mirror is the reflection of the other character in the film. And going back, just because you asked about the gender politics, I mean, people like to put gender politics into everything, but I think there really is a little bit of it in this film. For example, in the golfing story, like I said, it's funny because the men are kind of interchangeable to the woman, but then you look at the role of women going back in society, if they, were of middle class or upper class, often they did just have to marry the most convenient person. I mean, look at Jane Austen. That's all about marrying the right people, even if you don't like them. And she was very witty about it. So I think it's a bit of a black humour on this cultural thing as well, which is the very passive woman, the very traditional, but also at the same time isn't too fussed because maybe women didn't always have a choice in the past, but then this is contrasted in the mirror segment. So the lady in this is very modern, very brash, very strong, very chic. And we have, like has been mentioned, this focus on the bed. We see the bed in the mirror. He talks about the bed. The bed is the focus in the antique shop. So this has that underlying suggestion of sex and what happens in the bedroom, which is, as we all know, political. The bedroom cannot be free of the political. What happens in the political sphere enters into the domestic, and between men and women and between men and, everyone that has a relationship. So he's looking in the mirror. He sees these dark, primal, violent aspects of his nature, and maybe this is the masculine, and he's quite scared of these traits of his person or his masculinity, and this deeply held anxiety that has travelled throughout history about women and their ability to unman men or commit evil or be witches or, in somehow interfere with men and their lives and their power and their sexual power. So it is very much an anxiety about that. And he's seeing this and he acts out, and she smashes the mirror, which is quite symbolic. She takes control. Yes, these aspects are there, but he doesn't have to give in to them.
Well, and he tries to kill her, so there's...
Yes, that's why act out these impulses and dark parts of this masculinity, and we hear about this dark, brooding, hyper-masculine character from the past.
Yeah, but you could say that he was weak until she took center stage and smashed the mirror.
But yeah, so it is interesting. I think there is very much that current through it.
Yeah, that's a brilliant way of looking at it. I think that's really true. And of course, the idea of the mirror, this is an 18th century mirror, which links to the idea of the Victorian hearse. This whole concept of the past again coming back to the present.
It's a legacy.
Yeah.
And I think this film is very much about legacy. We see that in the golfing segment, how it's basically a black satire on the culture. We see references to the past all the time. And in looking at yourself in a mirror, what does he see? He actually says that he sees evil. So therefore he's looking at himself. He sees evil within himself. But like you said, he's looking into the past. He's saying evil in the past. Is it an acknowledgement of how this woman was treated in the past, or how it's all about legacy? So yeah, very, very interesting. And again, even in the ventriloquist story, it's about identity. Looking in a mirror is about identity. A little doll taking on dark aspects of his owner's personality is about identity and conflict of identity. And I know in one of the extras, one of the gentlemen refers to sexuality as well, and a conflicted sexuality, that there's that running through it as well. So you can definitely read all of that into it.
What one thing is very strange about the sort of hidden violence of people is the Mervyn Johns character. I mean, why does he strangle the doctor?
Yeah.
It's a completely irrational thing that in that particular aspect of the film, there's no logical sort of explanation about the past coming back, or it's why does he do it? I think that's one of the reasons why it's so unnerving, because suddenly out of the blue, he decides he's going to kill someone. So these irrational urges, which I talked about earlier, don't necessarily have to make sense. They just come from nowhere. That is a particularly scary moment, I think. Yeah.
I had a theory about that one, actually.
Oh, right.
So there's this suggestion that our protagonist has seen all of these people before when they're in the room. They point out oh, you could have seen me here. I had a picture in the newspaper, or you may have seen me here. So I began to wonder, are they all figments of his mind, that they're just these random faces from his daily life that have implanted in his subconscious, and therefore his dreams? And the house is actually his mind, because often spaces represent the mind, and, you know, different rooms represent different aspects of the mind. The house is where he hears these things, the events take place. Yet he always murders this psychoanalyst at the point of sharing his story in getting to the end. So before he actually gets to the end, he murders this psychiatrist, and that's when he descends into this surreal darkness and confusion. And it plays out over and over again. So it mimics that very random incoherence of the dream state, or your psychological problems that we can have that we're unable to deal with, that at that point of breakthrough or resolution, it's unable to be dealt with in the dream or in real life or in conversation. So that was a little theory that I had.
So he kind of kills the psychiatrist because he doesn't want to find out about
He can't get there. He can't confront that final darkness or trauma or aspect.
Yeah. The psychiatrist will reveal to him things he doesn't want to know, basically.
Yes. So he kills him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before it gets to that point. And so therefore he has to relive it over and over, but can never rid himself of it because he can't confront what the problem actually is. That was my little theory on it.
Brilliant.
Doomed to repeat.
Yes. Again and again.
Suzanne, you didn't mention your favourite segment from the film.
No, well, mine's a bit different. And I'm actually just going to talk for a little bit, because I'm actually going to tell the story, the true story that this segment is based upon. So my favourite is the Christmas ghost story. And I know this is one that is not the favourite of many people. It gets overlooked. So the Christmas story about the children, I think it really strongly references the tradition of the English ghost story, and particularly the tradition of telling ghost stories at Christmas time. So it's important to note that in England, Christmas Eve had a similar role to Halloween. It was a time when people told ghost stories and dressed up. So it was called mumming or guising, and that sometimes happened on Christmas Eve. And this was, of course, popularised by Charles Dickens in A Christmas Carol. And I find this part of the film is just a little bit Dickensian, and I think it's very endearing. I love uncanny children, and they have a long role in English literature. And much of children's fiction, as I mentioned way earlier, is about the uncanny. And the stories are particularly potent from the point of view of children. The supernatural in children's stories often signified loss or loneliness and coming to terms with a loss, or also coming of age. Often the transition from childhood to adulthood is signalled by a supernatural event. And this is even really apparent in modern horror like Carrie, or anything to do with teenagers and the supernatural. It's also about the passing of time. Again, this obsession with time as we pass from childhood to adulthood, and also from the psychological view of the film about exploring childhood, which is always like a key factor in that kind of Freudian psychology. And I also really love it just because it's about a girl and it's beautiful. I love the costumes. It's whimsical and Victorian. And it's actually based on a true story about Constance Kent, also known as the Road Hill House murder, which was one of the most well-publicised and infamous murder cases of the Victorian age. And I cannot emphasize what a scandal it was and how well publicized it was. People were obsessed with this at the time in the media. So Constance Kent grew up in a comfortable middle-class family, but the family was plagued by gossip, so they moved around a lot. This gossip surrounded her mother, who, after bearing 10 children, 4 of which died, she understandably suffered from some depression and mental health issues. Of course, the lack of understanding about postnatal depression and mental health at this time led to her being labelled as insane. Meanwhile, Constance's father was having an affair with the children's governess, who was mistress of this big fancy house in all but name. Given the circumstances, Constance's mother had become quite inconvenient and was shipped off to an insane asylum where she died. Shortly after her death, Mr. Kent married his governess, and Constance and her brother William were not happy. They hated their stepmother, especially when she had children of her own which were favoured over them. Then in 1860, Constance's 3-year-old half-brother, Francis Kent, who we see in this film as a little ghost, was abducted and murdered. His body was found brutally stabbed to death with his throat slashed, and the young man in this film describes it in some detail, quite luridly, which was the case at the time in the media. People were just ravenous over this story and the disgusting details. Local police were at a loss, so they sent for a detective witcher of Scotland Yard, who almost immediately placed the blame on 16-year-old Constance due to a missing nightgown, which he presumed had been covered in blood and that she'd disposed of. He also based this on the incorrect assumption that madness was hereditary, which we of course know is not true, but he thought so, therefore she must be insane, just like her mother, so must have done this hideous deed. However, people at the time could not comprehend that a young, gentle woman could do such a thing. They actually thought it was absurd. And with the help of an expensive lawyer, the charges against her were dropped. So that could have been that. But shockingly, in 1865, a now 21-year-old Constance actually confessed to a priest that she had murdered her sibling, which resulted in her being found guilty. And this was really controversial because it was found that in English law, under the Church of England, there was no legal privilege between priests and penitents, such as in Roman Catholic law. Many people actually believe that Constance may have been innocent and that she was actually covering for her brother, who she was extremely close to. But she was sentenced to death by hanging, which was later commuted to life in prison. She served 20 years before being released when she disappeared without a trace, and people often wondered what happened to her, where did she go? So here's the connection with Australia. She actually immigrated to Australia in 1886 and became one of Australia's most distinguished pioneering nurses. She nursed lepers at a Sydney leper colony and became matron of the infamous Parramatta Industrial School for Girls, which was a really nasty, notorious reformatory. And to all accounts, she actually cleaned the place up. She was really well liked. She was very competent at her job and held in very high esteem. And she actually died as Miss Ruth Emily Kay in Strathfield in Sydney, which I know, Tony, you know exactly where that is. She died in 1944 at the age of 100, which was just 1 year before this film was released. And at the time, her true identity was actually not known. It was not known for quite a while. But her case was so huge and so shocking that she inspired lots of literature, including Wilkie Collins' The Moonstone, Mary Elizabeth Braddon's Lady Audley's Secret, and that's very obvious because we have the marriage with the governess in that. It has those themes of class and immoral women, and it explores, I guess, this idea of how could a woman be so cold and calculating. It also influenced The Detective in The Mystery of Edwin Drood by Charles Dickens, and of course this film, which explicitly references and talks about this case. So I just thought that was really interesting.
Fascinating. How old was she when she supposedly killed her brother?
16. So yeah, the little boy was almost 4. He was 3 going on 4. She was 16 and her brother William was younger than her. I'm not sure how old he was, but I mean, it was a really sordid story in the media. It was even suggested that she and her brother had an improper relationship as well. And that as the older sister, she was covering for him or covering for the father. It was, all very scandalous.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it picks up on this idea that we think children are innocent and good, which they aren't necessarily, and there's a lot of the influences could be said, especially in the light of what you've said, all the films about evil children, like, The Omen or whatever. That's another aspect of the uncanny. You think that the children are innocent, but they're human beings. So why shouldn't they be? I've always been slightly surprised when you get, I'm not surprised at the outcry because it is awful, but the surprise when a child or 16 is an adult, really, isn't it, nowadays? But, think of, in England, that famous case of the Bulgar boy who was killed by those two boys. Terrible, terrible, terrible. But there was huge surprise, and that surprise, I think, comes from the fact that we think that children somehow aren't human beings, that they're somehow not capable of these things. So I think a lot of the films about evil children tap into that anxiety, I think.
At the time of this murder, people actually thought that a girl, but because of her class, was literally not capable of doing such a thing. They thought it was just inconceivable. Yet had she been a poor girl, a girl, of poor repute, people would have readily believed it. So very class-oriented case, this one. And the fact she got off, a lot of people thought the father had done it. He was not well-liked. He was not a well-liked man. He was very powerful. So he apparently bullied police during the investigation. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot been written about this case. It was super famous. There's many books about it if you want to go and read more about it. That's why I love this story, just because it is based on this true crime and this very English tradition, very Victorian tradition. I love it.
Yeah,
absolutely love it.
Fantastic. Great. I've just found, while you were chatting, I thought I'll just find the thing that Freud says about the uncanny, because I think the thing we've got from this discussion is this film is an uncanny film. It's a perfect example of what that means. And he says the uncanny is, which in German is unheimlich or unhomely. It's something that is to do with all the things we've been talking about. I'm just trying to find the quotation. On the one hand, it means what is familiar and agreeable, and on the other, what is concealed and kept out of sight. I think that sums it up, really. It's about the things we don't want to know about, really, coming to light. I think all the stories in this film express that, brilliantly.
They certainly do, absolutely. But I was just enthralled with the story, Suzanne, about
it's an amazing story.
I'm writing an article about it at the moment, actually. So this was very well timed that I happen to have been reading about it recently.
Yes, it's interesting that it was chosen. as opposed to all the fictional inspirations. But yeah, I think it's a bit like Vampire, actually, which we started off before we started recording this. Vampire is not just based on Camilla by Sharon Lafano. It's based on the whole collection of stories, all sort of bits and pieces that filter through. And this film is partly based on real stories, partly inspired by stories, partly made up, bits of history. It's a melange of lots of different aspects of different things. And you could make a comparison with Vampire in that sense of the way it's structured. It filters through all sorts of different influences.
I think in 80 years' time, there'll be some other people talking about this film.
Yeah, hopefully so. Yeah.
It's never going to go away.
Quite easily. And it stands up in terms of its technical marvel as well. It doesn't feel like a 1940s film in terms of it's not drab. It's like it looks good. It looks almost modern in some ways. As you said earlier, the lighting that they use, the expressionistic scenes, it's something that can really stand up. And so, yeah, Jim, I agree. I think in another 80 years' time, it's the type of film which people look back on. The way there's the different stories throughout, it's kind of something that can appeal to lots of audiences, whether they like horror or not, I think. It's not, like we say, it's not a true horror film. It's more of a supernatural, uncanny film.
I think there's only one line in it that always makes me unintentionally laugh when the girl in the Christmas Story says, "I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid." Which is
hug me.
She's so sweet. I think she's such a sweet character. She's lovely.
Yeah.
And when she's telling her little, ghost story about how she went to this Christmas party and flirting with the other young boy and everything, and it gets to the end and they don't believe her. They believe all the other people, but they don't believe the young girl.
Well, yes.
But then the story is all about, well, you don't believe the young girl, she'll come and kill you during the night.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I love those upstairs scenes, those attic scenes, and the stairs.
Absolutely.
And there's another shot where she's in a small corridor as well. So it's again that little corridor. It's only small, but it is a close up. But again, it's like a corridor.
Well, stairs are essential in this sort of film. There's something about the stair which is sort of either going up into your brain or down into your subconscious or whatever. There's a symbol.
Absolutely. And it's always when you go up the stairs into the dark attic, that is obviously the deepest recesses of the mind where the dirtiest little secrets are kept, which always happens in Gothic stories, like a picture of Dorian Gray, perfect, easiest example. Up in that attic, it's where all the dirty secrets are.
I would think you keep your mad wife upstairs and in Jane Eyre, or in the cellar. There is actually, I won't bother finding it, but Jung, in his autobiography, talks about a dream he had, and he says, I was walking through this house and I went down and I discovered a cellar. He said, what I was doing was exploring the depths of my psyche. So the house as a symbol of the brain and the mind is a very powerful one, and that's why it's the house of horror. The word house is an interesting one, isn't it? But we tend to think of this connection, the house of horror, the fall of the house of Usher. It's an interesting word because it expresses the complexities of the mind, I think. Have we exhausted the subject, do you think? It sounds like we have.
I think we have. But I got to tell you,
I've covered all my notes.
For those of you who are listening who have not seen this film, do not miss out. Do not skip on the fact that even though it's 80 years old, black and white, you must see it. It is one of the greatest British anthology uncanny films you will ever see. But yeah, I'm not going to call this a horror film anymore, Dave. You're right. It is definitely an uncanny film for sure.
I think the package is great because you do. I know you don't want to talk about it in great detail, so I won't do. But Flesh and Fantasy is a marvelous comparison to that because it deals with the same sort of ideas. You've got a doppelganger story. You've got the idea of the future being foretold. You've got the idea of masks and disguise.
Yes.
What is real and what is fantasy? So, and plus lots of wonderful at the very beginning, all those demonic images of people in costumes. I mean, that's just and skeleton outfits and things. It's great. But so it's a marvelous counterpart. So it's a brilliant package, really. Yeah,
it is. Absolutely.
I adore the masquerade mask shot in Flesh and Fantasy. adore that whole section of that film and how it's about this lady and kind of, in essence, her body image and,
Well,
how she sees herself. It's fantastic.
I think the other thing I really like about the film is the doppelganger idea, the mirror idea we've got in Dead of Night. Robinson talks to his subconscious in the film. So we see his reflection in a pair of spectacles. There's a reflection in a shop window. He talks to his shadow over the fireplace. It's real Jekyll and Hyde stuff, fantastically photographed. So yeah, it's a marvelous counterpart to Dead of Night.
Maybe we should talk about the extras on the disc a little quickly.
Of course, definitely. Paul, you've heard the commentary, haven't you?
Yes, I listened to the commentary the other night, and it covers a lot of different topics. It's one of the type of commentaries that I like, which covers both an analysis of the film and production history of the film throughout. So she manages to really cleverly weave those two together. If an actor pops up, she'll give you a bit of a history, but then she'll also pay attention to the themes throughout the film. Covers a lot of the things that we discussed, and she also goes in deep in each of the stories as well. Yeah, she mentioned a lot about the beds. I know that's one thing you brought up, Suzanne. So yeah, in the commentary, Pamela does go into a discussion on the beds throughout and the sort of like the sexuality in the film, and then she also does discuss the underlying homosexuality themes in a couple of stories, specifically in the ventriloquism story. Talks about that Michael Redgrave himself was bisexual, and maybe that's a nuance in his performance. He often refers to the doll as him. I need him. I can't live without him. Something that resonated with me as well personally. She talks about the whole overarching story as well, and in terms of the supernatural and the conversations that the characters have. Initially, they sort of laugh off the supernatural, and I think that's something we mentioned before, that if we're uncomfortable with something, it's easier just to laugh at it rather than face it, and that's something that's kind of in those first early scenes in the house. But yeah, as a commentary, it was extremely well researched and very interesting to listen to alongside the film. So I can recommend people give that a listen once they've seen the film.
Absolutely. Probably one of my favorite extras is John Llewellyn Probert interview about Short Sharp Screams, Dead of Night and the British Horror Anthology. The reason why I like it so much is because I love, as you know, I love horror anthology films, especially Amicus, as David mentioned earlier. Believe it or not, I have not seen Asylum. I must see that ASAP.
You must, yeah.
No, I have to.
Yeah, John is great in that. I think it's so exhaustive. It covers everything, and he's very good on the history of anthologies themselves. Really, so that's rather wonderful to hear and talk about that. But yes, you get a whole overview of all the films this film really inspired. Yeah,
I was just going to say it was great. I really enjoyed that one.
Yeah, he talks about the tradition of ghost storytelling in a gentleman's club, for instance, which Flesh and Fantasy, of course, starts off in a sort of gentleman's club, doesn't it? So it's all part of that Victorian tradition of telling each other stories, and as Suzanne said, in the Christmas story tradition as well. So he goes into that in great detail. It's a very entertaining piece, I think.
I loved how he talked about the book anthologies as well.
Yes, and he had the books to show too, which is really
I love
beautiful.
that. That's like if you follow Bookstagram on Instagram, you'll love this extra.
Yes, I said to him after I'd watched it, I said I wished I'd kept my Pan Book of Horrors, which I used to have quite a few of, but I'm afraid they went with various other things. But he said, no, well, I lost a lot of other things, but I kept hold of those, which is the best thing to have done, I think. Yeah.
So the Remembering Dead of Night documentary was really good too.
Yes, yeah.
That was very in-depth.
I haven't seen all of that yet. I've only seen the beginning of it because I think, as Tony said, housework got in the way. But
that's a proper little documentary there.
Yes, all the extras are a sizable length, which is good when you don't just have like a 5-minute passing thing. You actually get, like yourself, David, your extra, I think it's 40+ minutes. Like they're all so in depth and yet all cover different aspects, as I think we've each done as well today. So it's a lot to mine from the film.
David, I got to tell you though, with your extras of all of other Imprint releases as well as Dead of Night, What I love about your extras is how you perform on your piano and you give the demonstrations. It's fantastic. I love them.
Well,
Definitely.
thank you so much.
I
That's great.
second that.
I must say they filmed them in a different sort of way. Normally, that we just have one camera, but they bought, I think, 3 cameras or something. So you get lots of different angles, cinematic, which is nothing to do with me. But anyway, I thought they filmed it in an unusual way. Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, delighted. It's always fun to do.
Jim, what about you? What do you have a favorite extra?
I stayed away. I started with David's segment, and he started to play the piano. I thought, you know what, I'm going to stay away from this because I don't want to be influenced too much by other people. I want to put my tack on the film, but I will actually go through the extras probably Saturday.
Yeah, I think it's a bit like reading introductions to novels, isn't it? You read the introduction after you've read the book, otherwise you don't get your own response to things. So I think it's very sensible.
Yeah, well, I'm sensible sometimes, but not all the time, unfortunately.
And Imprint have also included a little restoration comparison too, which is interesting to see how the film.
I saw that. That was quite startling. The difference between the before and after. Yes,
and the soundtrack. Yeah, the improvements on the soundtrack. Yeah. I mean, there is a recording of the music on CD. I think a new recording, which is really worth listening to because the quality of that recording is not very good, even though it's cleaned up. So it's worthwhile listening to it in stereo because you really get a lot you don't get in the soundtrack.
Must give it a listen. Try and find it, definitely.
Trouble is, I'll have that feeling of dread again.
Suzanne, how about you? Do you have a favorite extra or whatever, or something that really fascinates you?
Well, I talked about David's extra at the beginning, and yeah, that was very interesting. Especially, I loved hearing about the composer, what he's done, because, as I said, we don't often hear, maybe stories about composers. I really love the short, sharp screams. I thought that was great. As I said, I love seeing the books, all the book covers, and that was a fantastic, unexpected addition. Like a really cool, all about British anthologies, which really, really interesting. I'd watch that again and again.
I just love when people talk about their libraries. You could just put a camera in front of someone and say, "Look, this is my book collection," and get them to talk about it. It's always interesting. Yeah.
Oh, the documentary as well. That was really in depth. I was surprised. I started watching it and I thought, oh, it'll be 20 minutes or something, and it's over an hour. I thought, wow. And it's just lots of different insights into the film. And of course, there's no right or wrong way to interpret a film, which is why it's interesting to hear all different perspectives from all different kinds of people. So we have everyone there in the documentary. Then we have this really great commentary from a lady as well. So we're getting all these different perspectives on the film, which just makes it all the more interesting.
Yeah. All in all, this double feature of Flesh and Fantasy and Dead of Night, it's worthwhile to have in every film collection. These movies are just incredible and basically a time capsule of early to mid-40s anthology films and uncanny horror films. Absolutely. I cannot praise it enough. I know, Jim, you love it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's a sort of film that I will watch at least once a year. Because also what I found is that you get something new out of it. You see something that you've missed previously, It's a very, very clever, thought-provoking film.
Yeah, absolutely. And then follow it up with The Innocents, which is Georges Aurique's last horror film, really, which is the most amazing example of uncanny filmmaking as well. But I mean, that blends his music with electronic effects and sound.
Absolutely.
The final moments of that film, just from a sound point of view, are incredible. I think hugely innovative and strange.
When I saw both those films theatrically as a double feature at that festival, it was perfect. It was the perfect double, but it was coincidental for me anyway that I didn't know that Georges Ulrich did the music for The Innocents until the credits, obviously. But my goodness, that double feature was amazing, and The Innocents has some of Freddie Francis's greatest cinematography I've ever seen in the great black and white 60s horror film. It's incredible.
It's a complete masterpiece of cinema, not just of a supernatural film. It's just it's just an amazing thing. Yeah.
For those of you who haven't seen The Innocents, you must ASAP. You have to do it. It is incredible.
Okay, I will have to watch that one. I've noted it.
You really must. And you must, Tony, watch Asylum as well.
I have to, yes. I have to watch Asylum, definitely.
Looks like our weekends are fully booked then, doesn't it? Yeah.
Looks like it.
Thank God.
This conversation was so informative, so entertaining, so educational, actually, for
a lot, yes. It's amazing.
A lot has come through. A lot has come out of this conversation, and it was incredible.
Yeah.
And I think we had the perfect guests for this episode because they had great insights to every single story for this amazing anthology. And I can't thank you all enough. This episode, I think it'll be one of our best as well, because the information that we give in this episode for this title, it may intrigue more audiences to watch it. And I think it's incredible.
Well, I'm delighted, and I think Suzanne had some amazing things to say about that true life story. Yeah, fascinating. And the beds, which I sort of picked up on, but I mean, the beds are something I'm going to go back and have a look at. All those beds, I think, it's interesting.
If you want to get deeper into the bed, I tend to overthink things. I tend to overthink things. But they're describing the bed in great detail, and they talk about the grapes and the vines. Is this a reference to the bacchanalian nature of men and women? Is this the revelry and sex of the bacchanalia?
Yeah. No, it's all been, as you say, very carefully thought out. Yeah.
Don't you just love her insights? I adore them.
I never would have thought of anything like that. It really it's actually enhanced my love for the film.
Indeed. Yeah.
So thank you so much for this.
Yeah, it's amazing.
That's all right.
Our love of cinema is what brings us closer together, I'm going to say.
Indeed, yes.
Without cinema, we wouldn't have this.
No.
True.
Yep.
Yeah, and I feel blessed to be... No, honestly, I feel blessed.
It's wonderful. The fact that we can talk about all this together is a sort of technological miracle. But I mean, it is marvelous. That's what life's all about, isn't it? It's about.
All right, anyway. Well, I guess this episode is over, and I can't thank Paul, Suzanne, Jim, and more importantly, David for joining us in this episode. Joining me in this episode, it really means the world. I couldn't be more blessed with this group of people discussing one of the best films of the 40s.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been a complete joy.
Thank you, Tony. It was been great listening to David and Suzanne. Especially your stories were great, and Jim's always wonderful to talk to you. So thank you.
Well, I'm on cloud 9, so I will soon come off that cloud because I'm going to work.
Oh.
So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And I'd love to speak to Suzanne a lot more because another wealth of information and a great viewpoint. And David, thank you for your time.
A pleasure.
And as for Paul, well, you know what I think of you, Paul, and you know what I think of you, Tony.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah.
Pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you for having me. And wait till the dead of night to watch Dead of Night, because I think it's the perfect Dead of Night picture. Put it on around midnight and it'll creep you out.
Hope you don't wake up within a nightmare.
Reoccurring.
I'm
Good
afraid,
point.
way past my bedtime, I'm afraid.
Anyways, thank you so much, everybody, for listening, and hope you have a great one. Speak to you soon. See you
Thank
all
you.
soon.
Bye.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this latest episode of Imprint Cast. Imprint Cast is a part of Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network. Thank you very much for listening and hope you have a great day.